Mark Thompson had lived in the Arizona desert long enough to understand its silence, its language, and its secrets. But that evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he sensed something different, an unease he couldn't explain. The faint sound behind the fallen mesquite tree didn't belong to the usual desert creatures. It was softer, human, and desperate. When he pushed the branches aside and saw the tiny figure curled into the sand, everything inside him tightened. The boy looked half alive, as if the desert had tried to swallow him whole. Mark didn't think, he simply acted. He scooped the child into his arms, feeling how weightless he was, how his bones pressed through his thin clothing. The boy flinched at Mark's touch, but he was too weak to resist. Back at the cabin, Mark placed him near the small wood-burning stove, wrapped him in blankets, and heated broth on the stove. The child stared at him with wide, haunted eyes, as if unsure whether Mark was a rescuer or another danger. Only after several sips of warm broth did the boy's breathing slow, his trembling easing just enough to let exhaustion take over. When the boy finally woke hours later, he didn't speak at first. He only watched Mark move around the cabin, studying every small gesture, as though trying to decide whether he could trust this stranger. Mark kept his distance, offering gentle questions but demanding nothing. Slowly, the boy's fear softened, replaced by something fragile, safety. But just as Mark began to feel a quiet relief, the boy's lips parted. His voice was cracked and trembling, barely more than a breath, yet the words struck like lightning. "They took my sister." Mark froze, understanding immediately that this child's suffering hadn't come from nature. The boy didn't explain details, not yet. Trauma held his voice hostage, and Mark didn't push him. But those 4 words painted enough of a picture. Someone had taken this child's sister, leaving him alone in the desert to fend for himself. That kind of fear didn't come from getting lost. It came from being hunted, chased, or escaping something too horrifying to retell. Mark's mind raced through possibilities: illegal camps, traffickers, or strangers who preyed on remote reservations. He didn't know who or what the boy had fled from, but he knew one thing with certainty: the child needed protection. Over the next 4 days, their bond grew in small, quiet ways. Mark made simple meals, kept the cabin warm, and cleaned the cuts and bruises on the boy's skin. The child followed him around, never more than a few steps behind, like a frightened shadow afraid of disappearing again. Sometimes he cried in his sleep, calling out in Apache words Mark couldn't understand. Other times, he would wake and cling to Mark's shirt until the nightmares faded. Mark learned to sit beside him, offering silent reassurance. The boy may not have spoken much, but his eyes told stories of fear, loss, and a desperate longing to be reunited with his sister. By the 4th morning, just as the sky shifted from deep purple to pale gold, the cabin felt unusually quiet. A stillness settled over the desert, a kind Mark hadn't felt before. He sensed a change coming, something heavy. And then, without warning, a loud, firm knock rattled the wooden door. The boy flinched, eyes widening with terror. Mark stood slowly, instinctively stepping between the child and the door. When he opened it, his breath caught. 3 Apache women stood outside, their faces carved with fear, hope, and a fierce determination. In that moment, Mark understood. The quiet days were over. Something much larger had arrived at his doorstep. Mark stood frozen in the doorway, the cool morning air brushing past him while the 3 Apache women remained perfectly still. Their expressions carried generations of resilience and sorrow. The eldest woman's eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something deeper, an urgency that seemed carved into her bones. Behind Mark, the little boy clung to the edge of the doorway, peeking out with wide, trembling eyes. The moment the women saw him, their breath hitched. One of them covered her mouth, fighting back a sob. It was clear this reunion had been prayed for, feared for, and desperately awaited. Mark stepped aside gently, allowing the women into the cabin. The boy hesitated, caught between fear and recognition. But when the middle-aged woman knelt and whispered something soft in Apache, his body crumpled. He ran into her arms, burying his face in her clothing, shaking with silent sobs. Mark watched the scene with a lump in his throat. Relief was there, yes, but also pain, and unspoken heaviness. The eldest woman touched the boy's back tenderly, as if confirming with her own hands that he was real, alive, safe. Tears slipped down her cheeks even as her voice remained steady. Once the child calmed, the eldest woman turned to Mark. She thanked him with a quiet dignity that felt more powerful than any grand gesture. Her words carried the weight of a mother, a leader, someone whose community had suffered too many losses. Mark nodded humbly, but confusion lingered in his eyes. He needed answers. What had happened to the boy? Where was his sister? And who were they running from? The women exchanged solemn glances, silently debating how much to reveal. Finally, the eldest exhaled deeply, as if preparing to open wounds that hadn't yet healed. She explained that several children from their reservation had gone missing over the past months. Some returned, traumatized and silent. Others did not return at all. They had searched tirelessly, fearing history was repeating itself, outsiders exploiting their isolation, targeting those least protected. The boy and his sister had vanished 3 nights earlier, taken from a remote area near a dry riverbed. Only the boy managed to escape. He ran into the desert, terrified and disoriented, surviving solely on instinct and desperation. Mark felt the truth slam into him. This was not a simple rescue. It was part of something far darker, something cruel. The women revealed that they had tracked footprints across miles of harsh terrain, following signs only they could read. Every clue led them closer, yet they found no trace of the girl. The boy was their only hope, the only one who knew what had happened. But he hadn't spoken since the night of the abduction. Trauma had locked his memories away. The women hoped that now, in safety, surrounded by familiar faces, he might remember something, anything, that could help them find her. Mark felt a surge of protectiveness. He realized he wasn't just a witness anymore. The moment he lifted that boy into his arms, he'd become part of their fight. When the women asked if Mark would help them, he didn't hesitate. He knew the desert better than most people around here, its canyons, its abandoned trails, its hidden dangers. The boy looked up at him then, eyes pleading, as if sensing that Mark's presence offered strength. Something inside Mark shifted, a resolve settling into place. This was bigger than fear, bigger than hesitation. It was about saving a child who still had a chance, restoring a piece of a community that had suffered too long. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the land, Mark understood one thing with absolute clarity: the real journey was just beginning.